How to make paper mache paste. I have one recipe that I modify depending on what I need to do. The base recipe is this. I bring 3 cups of water to a boil, and while this is boiling, I'm going to prepare what I call the cold mix. While the water is boiling, I'm preparing the cold mix, which is 1 cup of flour, and I'm talking all-purpose white flour here. I tried with whole wheat and I did not like the texture. So all-purpose white flour is the cheapest you can get at the supermarket, works fine. And then to that I add just enough liquid to make it liquid. I don't want it to be like pancake or crepe batter. I want it to be liquid, so it pours really well. So it's about, for 1 cup of flour, I'd probably go for 1.5 cups of water. But in this case, I'll just eyeball it. That's about 1 cup. And I'll shake it, I'll stir it together. As I stir, I realize that I don't have enough water, so I'll just keep adding some. Now this should be enough to make this thing pourable. And you want to stir with a whisk until you have no lumps. If you have lumps now, they might reduce in the mix in the hot water, but it's better to not have lumps at all. So it's a little bit different every batch, so I should have reserved more water for me, but I forgot. So keep stirring until there's no lumps. It's a very forgiving recipe. How forgiving? Well, I'll tell you, usually in the past I would go with 1/2 cup of flour for the same quantity of water in the boiling mix. So if 1/2 cup of a difference of flour still makes it usable, now I'm saying this is forgiving. Now go in all the corners. Normally I would be using a mixing bowl, like a round mixing bowl, so there is no corners. But I wanted to show you it can be done in different containers. Just make sure to scrape the sides and the corners. Now I've shown this to many different workshops over the years, and I've worked with bad conditions when we did not even have reserved pots to boil the water. We still managed. You can actually make this without cooking it, but I prefer cooking it. It seems to be stickier. I prefer the consistency and the smell of it. I've taken a paper mache workshop once as a student with a fellow paper mache artist from Mexico, and she said she would mix her flour and water at home the night before the workshop, so that the water would have time to do its job with the flour and it would thicken up pretty much the same as when you cook it. So I still tried it. Of course, I followed her recipe for the workshop, and I liked how it felt, but I still did not like the smell. So it's up to you. Prepare it in advance if you're not going to cook it. I prefer to cook it. So I got no lumps left. All I need to do is add about 2 tablespoons of salt. I only serve it in this because that's the container I had. I usually don't measure. I just toss a little splash of salt in there. The salt is there as a preservative. Just stir it in. You could also add it to the water later. Doesn't matter. Now this is the easy method. The old method was to mix everything together cold and then bring it to a boil, but that meant that you had to stir constantly, and it was really damaging to the nerves. It's really bad for your arms and your wrists and your shoulders, so I don't like that. Plus I'm injured in those. So once I was told on a video on YouTube that's no longer available, I'm sad that they deleted it, but it was a Canadian artist who used to live in Mexico. I forgot his name, I'm sorry, but it's been a few years. And that's where I learned how to mix this way. I changed the measurements a bit. I don't remember by how much. But I've been using this mix for several years now. And before this mix, I was just using a more diluted version. So my water is almost boiling. I'm waiting for a violent boil. Now we have a violent boil. All I need to do is incorporate the wet mix into the cold mix. A little bit at a time, like this. You want to wait for the water to boil again before you add more. Near the end, you have to constantly stir, but at first you don't need to that much. You just want it to keep moving. You don't want to burn the bottom of your pan. Tiny bit at a time. At first, tiny quantities, because you don't want to wait too long for that water to boil again. So, like right now, I'm waiting. That's when I say jokes in the workshops and stuff like that. I'll spare you for now. So this is, just make sure to scrape the middle and the sides. Keep adding small quantities. Eventually you'll be able to dump the rest of it in one shot, but at first I really want to make sure we have enough mass, we have enough of this material that's already hot, that adding a bigger quantity will not damage us. So it's boiling again, as you can see. Let's add some more. And this is so much less effort. I can already feel the mix thickening up. Those who cook out there, you'll recognize this texture when you make a sauce with flour to thicken it up. And the more you add, the thicker it gets. This is the time when you need to start stirring almost constantly, because you don't want it to burn. It's gonna get, you're gonna get a brown bottom pan, and then you have to soak it, and it's a bit annoying. So, like right now, it would be a consistency to use if you need a slippery paste, but I'm gonna keep going. Again, this is my foundation recipe that I will then dilute however I need for the purpose I'm going to do that day. Now, this is when I really need to start stirring a lot. See how much I have left? It's not much left. Maybe a cup. So, dump the rest in there. Make sure to scrape the sides, not waste anything. You could use a spatula for this. I did not prepare one. You could use your hands if they're not dirty, or preferably if they're clean. Just stir a little bit more. But I'm feeling a bit of texture at the bottom of my pan, so this is the time to stop. And to take it off the heat. So just take it off the heat right away. Don't put your plastic board onto your hot element, because that would be bad. So this will thicken up quite a bit. It's already thickening as it finishes cooking on its own. What I like to do at this point is add even more water, just a tiny bit, because I know it's going to get too thick for me. When it thickens up and it starts looking like there's cracks on the surface, that's not usable for me. So I just add a bit of water to compensate for that. It also helps cool it down if you want to use it right away. You don't want to burn yourself. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't like pain. So, by the way, right now I'm on a plastic tray. It probably shouldn't be, but for presentation's sake, I'll risk it. So that's it. There's almost no lumps in there. There's a bit. That's not a problem. You can strain it if you want. At this point, it's really hot and easy to strain through just a regular mesh strainer. I almost never need to do this. Like right now, it's pretty good. If you let it dry without covering it, if you let it cool down without covering it, you'll have a surface that dries and cracks, like I mentioned. That's why I recommend putting a lid on it to let it cool down if you're going to forget it for a while. So, or if you don't, like I'm just about to give a workshop to someone online, so I need to use this right away. So I'm going to cool it down even more so I don't burn myself in a few minutes. This stuff is amazing as a paper mache glue. I've tried so many different varieties, and including diluting some wood glue, diluting some carpenter's glue, making my own recipes from other things, including different kinds of starches. They wet the starches. They re-wet too easily, so my paper mache shells were distorting too much. The wood glues always became brittle over time. We're talking years. Without any stress to them, they still develop cracks or breaks without any other explanation that the PVA component of it is weak over time for some reason. So I know some people have experienced completely different things with those glues and they love them. But in my experience, most of the work I kept that contained PVA glue as paper mache paste, all those I kept became brittle. So again, without much stress to them, they were just on my walls. So that's why I stopped using those as a paper mache glue. No PVA glue allowed in my recipes. So wheat paste is amazing because you can sand it really, really well compared to other glues. It does re-wet, and that's an advantage if you need it to, but it doesn't re-wet too fast, so it gives you time to work without sogging your pieces if they're hollow. And another advantage is that it's biodegradable. You can toss that in the compost to feed your soil, to feed your compost. It's amazing for that. It smells better when it's cooked, for me anyways. It almost smells like bread or some kind of dough. You can color it if you want to count your layers. I take a small portion off of it and I color that with a dye or preferably a pigment. Be careful if you use a rusty pigment like iron oxide, it might develop a smell in your paper pulp. Happened to me once. So maybe just squirt a little bit of acrylic color that's not iron oxide. And one last thing, I'm showing you this in this video tutorial series because it's a great product to prep your surface before you put CelluClay on it. It works on wood, it works on other paper mache strip projects, and it's also a great smoothing agent for CelluClay. Yes, you can smooth out with water, but it tends to peel the surface a bit, while this slicks it out and you move better. It doesn't peel the surface off. It also seems to sharpen the edges if you want to pinch them and create details. So for all these reasons, wheat paste is your friend when you're working in combination with CelluClay. It's also a great wheat paste to add to your paper pulp products. You don't need anything else. You don't need to add wood glue to it. Just a bit of wheat paste to make it bind together and make it stiffer. Again, your wheat paste will make it easier to sand. Keep it in the fridge with a lid on, of course. It will keep for 5 days approximately. If it's clean, if it's not contaminated. If you make a huge batch, I would say never put any paste back into the main batch. Just take it out, put it in a smaller container. So when you're done, and if you still have some in your smaller container, just put a lid on that. Don't put it back in your big jar, and your mix will last you 5 days. I still smell it every time I open the container if I took a day off or something, just to make sure it doesn't smell sour, or if it doesn't have any weird colors. So, or if it doesn't smell too sweet. These are all indications that mold or bacteria development has gone too far. That's the wheat paste. Don't forget to cover it if you're not going to use it right away. You know, cover it while it cools down. If it does thicken up a little bit on the surface, that's fine. Like you see, it's starting to form a skin here. That's fine. Just stir it in. Stir it back in. If it's still not stirring properly, add a bit of water to it. In that case, cold water will do. Sometimes I'll just heat up some water in the kettle, and that will also speed up the mixing. Clean your tools right away. Like, well, if I let this whisk dry completely, I could still soak it in water for 15 minutes, and it should be easy to clean after that. Same thing for the pot. I tend to keep my paste in the pot if I'm going to use it the same day. If not, I'm going to transfer it to a cleaner container, so a clean container with a lid. Although sometimes I cheat and I put a lid on this pan, put it in the fridge directly. This is now a few days after I made this paste recipe for you. I did tell you to put a lid on it as it cools down, otherwise you're going to get some kind of crust, a jellified crust, that you then will mix into the rest, and you'll have a lumpy result. Well, here is what happens when you forget to put the lid on. And yes, honestly, I forgot. But it's a good thing, because I get to show you how to restore this to something a bit more useful. I mean, you can use it right away. It's just a little lumpy. These lumps will get squished as you paste it on top of your paper, like this. You have a piece about the size of your hand. That's my method anyways. Your preferences may vary, but as you squish that down, you'll see that the lumps are squished down too. If you see it white instead of transparent or translucent, that means you have too much glue. So just save yourself some money and some trouble, and just add just enough glue to make things clear and not opaque. And I mean the glue opaque. I don't want it opaque. So this is already usable, but I still prefer a much smoother paste. So what I do is I use again my kettle with some hot water in it, add a tiny bit at a time, and whisk it in until you have the consistency you want. It's also a way to make your paste a lot more comfortable to work with if you don't like the feeling of cold paste on your skin. I do prefer a warmer paste, but I can still use it cold. I have done so many times. It is your brain, you can hack it. I keep reminding people of that. I keep reminding myself of that because sometimes I forget. So you don't like something, you might learn to like it if you understand the advantages of no longer hating it and of using it instead of being used by it. But this is not a brain hacking video, so I'll stop right here. It's already a lot better, but I'll add a bit more. As it cools down, especially in the fridge, it does thicken up quite a bit. Eventually, though, as the paste gets older, you know, from the moment it was made, eventually it just won't work this way. It will not become smooth again. It will just behave weirdly, and that's the time, one of the times when you should probably just put it in the compost, feed your garden, etc. So this is good enough for me, but I could go on and add even more water. But I like my paste to be thick like this because it will stick to things and stay put. You can still move a piece of paper that you applied onto a surface with this consistency, but you know, after a minute or so, it will be very stable there. So I do like to be able to adjust. So that is how I restore my slightly lumpy paste to something not only warmer, but smoother to use. Now, why do I show you how to make this paste when I'm making a video series on CelluClay? Is because when I bond CelluClay to other materials, especially porous materials like wood or dry paper mache or dry CelluClay, the paste is what I use to bond the layers together. So, for example, if I wanted to add some paper strips or some CelluClay on top of this CelluClay sculpture, I would just start rubbing the paste here to reactivate the paper mache adhesives inside, so that when I do apply more, it will bond better. Although for this, I probably use water for this particular material. Considering it's very smooth, I've been smoothing it a lot in my classes when I teach. It's become a really good helper to demonstrate some techniques. Yeah, so the paste can be used for this. That's how I do it when I press paper pulp or CelluClay into a mold, and I want the craft paper to bond to the CelluClay that's been freshly applied. I make sure there's a coat of that glue painted in everywhere that I can reach, because it will really make them grab together and not separate. Same thing if I want to add strips. Now, if I wanted to add strips onto this, I would not use water. I would use the wheat paste again and put a tiny strip there. So I've already squished these. Thankfully, there's one over here I can use. So this is not a paper strip class, but I'll give you one of the foundations. I tear a bigger piece normally, something the size of my hand, so I don't waste time. And then from that piece, after it's pasted, I can tear the smaller pieces and put it where I want. So I would just do it like this. I just put it on like this, and I would massage the edges to make sure, everywhere, especially the edges, to make sure it's bonded and will stay put. Normally, I would have this sculpture on a stand, so I don't have to hold it. So both hands can work at once. I like one hand to hold, to stabilize, and one hand to apply. Or I use both hands to paste, so if I don't have to hold it, it's a lot better. And in terms of stands, I like to use plumbing fixtures, such as flange and nipple, or you can make your own out of wood. I also have a ball vise that you can use. I made a head for it so I could put some handles in it. So there's all sorts of ways you can use to hold your paper mache. In some classes, I've even used, bottles filled with glass, filled with sand or water as a base. It's very easy to find. You can tell your students if they're organizing and you just show up, they can find bottles and some sand or some water. We can use that as temporary stands. I'd prefer plastic bottles because they don't break for safety reasons. There you go. So that's how I apply paste if I were to go with one layer at a time, although most of the time I apply 4 at a time. As a bonus, I'll show you how I apply 4 layers of paper in one step. So in the same amount, about the same amount of time, I would apply one layer on a human head, for example, human-sized head. I would apply four instead of one. I mean, that's a good deal. The price to pay, because there's always a price, is you'll get a bit more bumpy results because the thickness that you're applying and overlapping together creates little steps, almost like tectonic plates meeting and rising a little bit. And that's thankfully because I'm using wheat paste. It's easy to sand off and make it smooth again. You can use just a lot of arm strength and and fatigue, or you could use a sanding machine or a sanding drum on a rotary tool. I like to use whatever I need for whatever job I'm doing. If it's a large, smooth area, I'll definitely use the palm sander, electrical, like a mouse or an oscillating circular palm sander. Or I can use, and for fine detail, I can go with the the sanding drum. And for even smaller detail, I can use the diamond bits. So these are all more extra tips. So how do I paste 4 layers at a time? First, I apply paste on both sides of my first sheet of paper. That one is applied on both sides because my hand was too clean already. It didn't have paste on it. Next, I put another piece on top. Oh, there was a piece of clay on that. Clay shavings fell into my paper box apparently. So as you can see, there's a bit of wrinkling, but I can smooth it out. So I have 2 layers right now in my hands. It doesn't overlap everywhere evenly, so what I like to do sometimes is just tear that off. I don't have to, but I prefer to. And I put it on the side of my container so it's easy to reach when I need to patch something. Now, I have 2 layers. What do I do with this? I usually go for something this size, and that's how I prepare my sheets in advance, about a little bit bigger than my hand. I make long strips, I tear them into smaller, shorter ones for this kind of result. So if they're all about the same size, they're easy to stack. Always respect the grain direction. How they tear will tell you what the grain is. So these two are both aligned vertically. If I hadn't inverted this one 90 degrees, it would have been a problem later when I try to tear it into smaller pieces, which I will need to do. So this piece is now 2 layers. I'm going to tear that one in half using my fingernails corners as a stabilizer as I tear. Now I could go faster, but that tends to make the direction change too much. Now I have 4 layers in my hand. If at 2 layers I have more of a shape like this, instead of doing a vertical tear, I would do a horizontal tear. In fact, I could do it now and get 8 layers. I hardly ever do 8 layers because it's excessively thick for a one session of drying. I prefer to limit myself to 4 when time allows. In fact, time always allows, because if you do go for 8, it will take more time to dry. So at 4, I feel secure that there's enough. I'm feeling a lump right here between the layers. I was not planning for that. So I could leave it there and sand it off later. This is probably something dry, like a flake of wood or something. There you go, I got it off. So fingernails are useful for these steps. I keep mine really short because when I sculpt in clay, I don't want to nick my surface. But I have enough right now to use those fingernails as stabilizer when I'm tearing. Now imagine this is 4, because I don't want to peel that off, and I call this my pancake stack. I keep my stack moist enough that it doesn't want to separate or anything. So if I'm not going to use it for very long because this goes away real fast. I apply it quickly, but as I'm explaining, it takes me a lot more time to do it. So make sure to add a bit of paste if you feel that it's starting to behave differently. So what I do is I tear smaller pieces, again using fingernails as grabbers, and I make smaller pieces. For something like this neck, this size would be fine. But if I'm going where the ears are, I need half that size. You want to make the pieces as small as you need for the paper to accept being put in that position. Paper is made flat and wants to remain or go back to flat. The only way to prevent it from doing that I know of is, well, a combination of 2 things. You need a glue that's tacky enough, such as wheat paste when it's thick enough. And also you need to use small pieces, because the wider the piece on both directions, the more power it will have to want to get flat again. Step by step, tiny pieces at a time. And I would overlap a lot. If you become lazy, and you might not notice that you're doing it, but eventually the pieces tend to get bigger. Remind yourself you are saving time if you use smaller pieces, not wasting it. It does feel like you're wasting time. Oh my gosh. If my pieces were larger, I would cover my surface faster. Yes, you would. But then you end up with more wrinkles, more more air pockets, more separation problems, more distortion, and all of these have to be corrected if your aim is to create something that is even and durable as well. If you don't care, then fine, do whatever. But if you care, like I do, about your results being both aesthetically pleasing and durable, then I would recommend following this advice and using smaller pieces. As I'm talking, I'm realizing that my pieces are indeed a little bit bigger than they should be, but that's okay. By the way, you see this little cavity here? That does happen, so I'll just add more paper. Eventually, when this is dry, I can go back and fill that in with some CelluClay. That's another application of CelluClay that I love because it's faster than trying to put more and more and more paper several times. And CelluClay, if you keep it thin, it will dry fast. It will dry just as fast as 4 layers of CelluClay of paper strips if your CelluClay is fine enough. So, and yes, I can peel that off if I don't wait too long. Like I just peel it off with my fingernails here. So another advantage of wheat paste. If I were to do this with wood glue, I'd probably tear a lot.